All right, so this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 6, Section 3, War in the South. So initially, recall that Great Britain, their strategy initially was to isolate New England, put NE. That is to isolate essentially what was the problem colony, Massachusetts, from the rest of the United States. That did not yield results, even though the British were victorious in many of their land engagements with the Continental Army, and even though that George Washington spent much of the war avoiding any confrontation with the British, the revolutionary movement wasn't over, and it dragged on year after year after year after year. So the British changed their strategy, and that was to focus more on the southern colonies. And what led Great Britain to do that, essentially, was that they believed that in the southern colonies, they would get more support from the loyalists. In other words, there would be more people in the colonies that supported Britain, that they could utilize the enslaved proclamation. Recall, we talked about Dunmore's proclamation, which granted freedom to any enslaved person willing to fight for the British cause and Native American allies in that particular region. It was also true that the southern colonies were more divided, especially between urban and rural populations. You might think back to something like Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, which occurred. But there were also other movements in the 1700s between rural and urban populations there. And initially, Great Britain was successful, especially when it came to major confrontations. In a number of battles, the British were victorious. They were successful in capturing Savannah, which was the capital city of Georgia. And it really took a while for American, military leadership in the South to realize what Washington more or less had realized, and that was any direct confrontation with the British was a recipe for failure, and rather the Americans or the Continental cause ought to really try and spend most of the time evading the British Army and instead forcing the British Army to track them down. And that's essentially what happened in the South. General Cornwallis, he was in charge of British forces in the South. So you might say of him, he is the British general in the South. And more or less, his job was to, quote unquote, hunt down, I will say, rebel forces. And again, by making the British chase the Americans around, the American side was able to take advantage of various tactics and fared much better than they did with confronting the British straight up. But this also meant that, the American side would lose vital cities. Savannah was a city that was lost. Charleston, South Carolina was another city that was captured by the British. But because of the strong loyalist sentiment in the South, much of the fighting in the South can be, sort of best described as a civil war. That is, a lot of the killing that took place was between loyalists versus patriots. And, cities and towns were divided along these lines. Some colonial residents wanting to fight on behalf of the British cause, some residents fighting on behalf of the patriot cause or the independence cause. Long story short, it was colonist on colonist violence, depending on what side that one stood on for this. Eventually, though, General Cornwallis and the British managed to make their way to Yorktown. This is we'll just call it a port city in Virginia. And there, General Cornwallis and the British were hoping to receive support via the British Navy. It was believed that the American Navy could really do nothing to prevent the British from having the sea advantage. So, Cornwallis figured that he was safe at Yorktown. However, this is one instance where the French alliance really comes into play. George Washington and American forces, hearing that Cornwallis and the British Army was vulnerable in Yorktown, quickly moved by land. So we might say American forces, siege Yorktown by land. Meanwhile, the French Navy shows up. French Navy, say, cuts off escape. And after a couple days, when it became clear the British Navy was not going to rescue Wallace and that Washington's men on land were not going to allow Cornwallis to escape, General Cornwallis and British troops surrender at Yorktown. And this is important because Yorktown then becomes, we'll say this of Yorktown, this is the last battle in the Revolution. Right? The British surrender caused Great Britain, we'll say GB, to, lose the war, caused Great Britain to really give up. We'll say give up. We'll just say that, right? It caused Britain to give up. Back home, the British Parliament decided that this was no longer a war worth waging, and instead they would negotiate with the American side. Very iconic photo right here showing Cornwallis's surrender. Washington, I believe that's Washington up there. Maybe that's Washington back there. But the blue coats, that was the uniforms that the colonists used, and the British surrender going on right there. So the treaty that brought a conclusion to this conflict was the Treaty of Paris. One way to identify this Treaty of Paris from all other Treaty of Parises, there's a billion of them, is the date 1783. After Yorktown surrendered, since the French had gotten into it, since the Spanish had gotten into it, the peace settlement would be a little bit more complicated because there were more pieces. It wasn't just an American and British conflict. But amongst the provisions of the Treaty of Paris was a recognition of independence. So this is we'll say Great Britain recognizes the new nation. And again, the new nation that we're talking about is the United States. So you might say, even though the United States declared themselves independent in 1776, it wasn't until 1783 when a great power like the British recognized the United States as being legitimate. Of course, France had done so previously, but by winning the war, the British said, okay, this is a new nation. In terms of Western territories, the Americans got a lot of Western territories, so we'll just say all land to the Mississippi River. Would belong to the United States, right? So a lot of British territory passed hands. And one condition that the Americans agreed to was that loyalists, the people who had supported Great Britain in the Revolutionary War, U.S. agreed to not persecute